So today I'm here with Simon from Jellyfish. He's a senior director from brand strategy. Can you please, Simon, describe what kind of responsibilities and things you're working on there?
Absolutely. So I've been working for Webedia, then Jellyfish. Jellyfish acquired Webedia, the agency dimension of Webedia back in the day. So I've been working in total for 6 years almost, and evolved from senior planner to now senior director brand strategy. My role is essentially to help brands communicate better to their audience, getting a better understanding of audiences, of their brand, of course, and market dynamics. So I'm like literally at the crossroads of all of that in a platform world. So obviously, everything's moving really quickly. There's a lot of complexity involved. So I'm here to try and bring some simplicity in trying to explain things in the in the simplest way possible for creative to then come up with an approach that's going to make that brand cut through the clutter in a world of noise. So it's a very exciting position to be in. I think that strategists have such a strong role and so many things should be reinvented as well. I guess we're going to be talking about the role of AI in this, but essentially what this function of brand strategy, which has had so many names in the past. We were called digital strategists when digital was budding. Strategic planner, of course, was the original name, but the function of brand strategy has always been to simplify complexity. So I think that whatever the future holds, it's always going to be our role to navigate that complexity and trying to frame things differently for people to enjoy a brand in a way that they haven't seen before.
Yeah. And what kind of brands are you working with at the moment?
A lot of them, because I'm working on all the brand portfolio for Jellyfish France, some of the portfolio of Jellyfish UK, where I'm based now. I've been working a lot for BNP Paribas. You might know that banking brand.
Yeah.
French one, but of course with a global footprint. So we've been helping BNP Paribas for quite some time now, operating their social media for BNP Paribas Group, but also for the B2C operations of BNP Paribas. It's been a long way. We started with content for the websites back in the days. That was in 2018, I think. And then year after year, we gain hopefully client confidence on our ability to help them with social, help them with campaigns as well, because Webedia was not really seen at that time as a creative agency. So we're kind of, trying to show them that we could help them with much more than social content. So yeah, it's been a lot of social content strategy, but also campaigns. One of the latest was for an offer for BNP Paribas that's called Jeune Appart. So you have to know that in France, but I guess it's also the case for Berlin, when you're young, from 18 to 24, it's extremely difficult for you to find a flat to rent. Of course, because you have to prove that you earn like 3 times the amount of the rent, which no one does really. But it's also an essential need. You have to have a flat, right? So there's like this strong tension around how essential a need it is, and all the conditions that are asked, which are crazy when you think about what someone that age can bring in terms of revenue. And BNP Paribas came up with an interesting offer, which is a bundle of many things: 0% loan, Guarantee, which is basically a third party that helps you bring that guarantee to show any landlord, homeowner, or rental agency that you can be trusted, right? And we needed to promote that. And not only we needed to promote the offer, but we also needed to launch the TikTok account for BNP. So that was a hell of a challenge, because BNP is not really the kind of brand that you expect on TikTok, which is the home of entertainment, banking entertainment that just doesn't work together. And it's also a very institutional brand. So yeah, that was a hell of a challenge. So, I mean, I could go into how we made that happen.
I think this is super interesting. Like this corporate, well-established brand on TikTok is interesting. Like, how do you approach that?
So again, as a planner, my role is to get into the shoes of the people we're trying to communicate to. So I was talking to people from 18 to 24, looking for a flat in big cities, so Paris, but not only. And the first thing was to understand what's the issue and what kind of content do you consume when you're at that stage of looking for a flat on TikTok. And you know how the For You page on TikTok is really conditioned by the algorithm. My For You page is going to be really different than yours, especially living in the UK, in London. I'm going to get different content because also the way I consume content is going to be different than the way you do it. So the first step for me was, how do I hack my For You page so that the algorithm understands that I'm not Simon, almost 32, 30 at that time, but I'm Simon, 22, and I'm looking for a flat. So I was typing keywords like appartement, Paris. Of course, that was in French because I wanted to get like French content. And then days after days, I was like getting content that was a bit unusual on my For You page. So I knew that the algorithm was like kind of shifting from my usual consumption to something that was more a reflection of what someone that age would be consuming, which was already very interesting, you know. So the type of content creators was changing, the type of content was changing, and I was like really immersed into that For You page and that things, which was also like, I mean, already at that time, very rich in learnings. So I was taking notes, type of creators, how do they talk about that? Because obviously they're very, there's a lot of conversation around those difficulties, especially on TikTok when there's no real boundaries, like every possible subject is discussed, should be discussed. And at some point, I realized that yes, the content was seen and valued, but people that age, they also spend a lot of time in the comment section, you know? And sometimes it's even more entertaining to read the comments than the actual content is. And so people just rush in the comments and see things because people get really creative, you know? They also want to get crazy amount of likes. So they try to, you know, like make it funny, make it like witty. And the more witty, the more they get exposure and the more it helps with their personal brand on TikTok. Anyway, I was like, that's perfect because comments are going to be a great way for us to fuel that campaign with genuine content. Because this is also where they get real and genuine as they can be on TikTok. They go into the comment section and say those things. So the brief was mainly, how do we sound like a content creator talking about this specific subject? And we've been using those comments. We've chosen a content creator who's called D-Ace and who also happened to be a rapper. And we briefed that guy saying, you need to create an original rap song, which is going to raise awareness on that specific topic. But you have one constraint, just one. You need to use actual comments to write that. So the campaign would be that. The campaign would be the launch. We launched it as if we were like a music company, a label, trying to promote a new song. But of course, there was a promotional dimension to it because at the end, we want to end the rap song with the idea that we do have a solution, which is Je n'appart by BNP Paribas. So that was it. And honestly, that was like a great success. We got close to 82 million impressions. But more importantly, I mean, that was my personal KPI. As you know, a banking brand, just like a retailer in France, there's a lot of engagement, but most of the time it's not the kind of engagement that you're looking for. Because people get angry at you because you're a bank, because you're a retailer, you're too expensive. You're connected to money, you're connected to tension. So that doesn't really work. So yes, there is engagement, but not the positive engagement that you're trying to get.
Oh,
and my KPI and the KPI that we all embraced as a team was to get a very positive ratio of positive comment versus negative ones. You know, there's always going to be people trolling you, but you want to reduce that part and get as much positive and surprised and amused comments as possible. Because this is going to be a strong expression of your success in shifting perception. No one was expecting you as a banking brand doing that kind of thing. It doesn't look like the typical ad, which is also like good practice for TikTok because you want to look anything but an advertising campaign. And that's the kind of challenge that I think we need in advertising, to rethink entirely the way the classic advertising narrative on social media is completely different. And it's changing every day. Because what worked at that time on TikTok, like that campaign that I'm describing, probably won't work tomorrow, or it's going to work differently.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it, because you constantly have to reinvent the way you work.
Yeah, and how long was this ago? Like, when did this happen?
That was a year and a half ago.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
already you think it's changed that.
I think that what doesn't change is if you're willing to put on the work of understanding how an audience think, perceive your brand, perceive your industry, consume content, create content. If you're willing to spend that time, let's put it differently. You're going to you said before we started the podcast that you went to Portugal. If you're going to Portugal and you don't want to learn any words, you don't even know how to say hello or how are you, you can't really expect locals to not, I was about to say respect you. Of course, they're going to be respecting you, but you're going to be more kind to someone who's trying to understand your culture. You know, it's never going to be perfect, but at least you see someone with a good intention of trying to understand your culture and trying to make sense around what makes sense for you.
Yes.
As an individual or as a group, or, you know, so I think that's exactly the same for brands. We know that, I mean, some brands are more involved in culture. If you're going to be Netflix, it's going to be easier for you to be speaking culture because you're part of culture. If you're a banking brand, you're not part of the culture, at least that's on social media. You're seen as the enemy somehow. Some brands are really like embedded in culture, and for them, it's just like more immediate, the connection that there is between them and their audience. You're on Netflix, you're constantly producing and putting on shows that make culture on the daily. Like people are discussing that. It's part of their life. It's part of their, just the way they see the world, because they consume that and they see the world differently when they do. So you're really part of that. And the way you're going to communicate is going to be like very different from a brand that's far from that, you know? So you have very different ways of approaching the subject depending on the nature, and the brand is already like deep into culture, or if you have to make that happen. So I always find it really interesting to work on brands that don't have that immediate connection, because there's a question of surprise. It's more surprising when you manage to do that well. It's going to be more surprising and also more rewarding for the work you put on.
I think it's like, it makes me think of, have you seen Ryanair on TikTok? Like how they,
of course,
like pretty famous at this point then, and just like it's a very non-traditional way of approaching this.
Yeah, and it's also saying, I mean, I think what's brilliant in the way they've like nailed that TOV on TikTok is that it's also saying a lot about their positioning and then brand proposition. You know, you choosing the cheapest, so you can't really expect us to be nice to you. That's kind of a good one. So we're gonna be sassy. We're gonna be like, what, you ask us things, but you're already paying like nothing, you know?
Yeah.
And no, that's really funny, because that's also a brand that's showing there's a lot of distance and a lot of self-awareness.
Yeah,
which I think is like also good recipe to make it work on social. You don't want to take yourself too seriously.
Yeah,
I think there's also like a demand from consumers to be like, well, yes, your brand, yeah, you sell stuff, but I have more power than you do, because I'm the one consuming. I'm the one influencing others. So I have power over you as a consumer more than it was before.
Yeah.
For that reason, take it chill. We can discuss more in a more casual way. And I think it makes for an interesting environment now in terms of conversations setting between a brand and consumers. It can be casual, you know, it can be casual if you find the right way of approaching the subject, not trying to be someone you're not trying to sell stuff without trying to connect to culture and to us first.
Yeah,
which is now a given. You need to make that happen. Otherwise, whatever you have to sell is not going to land.
Yeah, I feel like that's something I hear a lot from especially marketers on performance side. Like what really works now is authenticity. Like they need to see real people and honesty, not like just actors and a facade. But I think people see through that pretty easily. So yeah,
absolutely. And also the we're talking about ad narratives just before. I think that consumers now are much more aware of the tricks of marketing and advertising. They also play with it. So that's also a new element now, because we've observed the rise of like an entire generation who became content creators. And obviously didn't happen from one day to another. But now you're a content creator. I'm also like at some point a content creator, like with a very small audience. But I'm still, I still have that perspective of how should I frame content in a way that's going to work and create engagement. So we have, as a generation now, we're more savvy in marketing. So that also changes the way you perceive advertising, because now you have more of a critical approach to it, because you know what works for you, because you make it work for your audience. Obviously, when a brand does it, you're like, well, this is good or this is less good, which is something that we didn't have as much, I think, 10, 15 years ago.
Exactly. I would like to go over to your story and like how you got into the industry. Like where did it start for you?
Well, it all started at Les Choses. I kind of had, I mean, my education background was more humanities, literature, and I wanted to work in communication for luxury brands. Then I've been working for a couple of them, and I was like, yeah, that's absolutely the direction I want to take for my future. So I wanted to enlarge a bit. I was interested about so many things, politics, culture. I just like to have my brain like constantly thinking about stuff. And I think that this job does that perfectly, because you see the world through the lens of consumption. So one could say it's a limited way of seeing things, but it's also like so central to our lives, you know? So I see advertising as sociology through the lens of consumerism. And that's what makes it so interesting for me. Get back to your question. I started at Les Choses, which is an independent creative shop that was founded by many partners, but one of them is Eric Tonkong, who also co-founded BETC, which is one of the biggest creative agency in France. So that was very much a culture of the idea. That was a small indie agency, which was a great way for me to get into the industry. Met actually so many valuable people there that are still really close friends now. Then from Les Choses, I had a second internship at Ogilvy in Paris, which was a whole different world, whole different way of approaching strategic planning, much more structured, much more international as well. Of course, Ogilvy Paris at that time was pretty big. I mean, still is pretty big and pretty connected. I was working on Vitel. I was working on Athlan at that time. Flix as well, which was Ogilvy Paris just won Netflix, which was launching in France a year before. That was back in 2015 or 16, something like that.
Yeah.
And a lot of Chanel as well.
Yeah.
Was there for 2 years, and then I had a great opportunity to work in a startup. So I took on a real turn, because that was like not advertising anymore. Friend of mine from school just joined this company, which was called StaffMe, still called StaffMe, which is basically a startup connecting young freelancers, most of them students, with companies for short-time assignments. And I was a sales there, I was a business developer. So you'd think, what's the connection with advertising? I think there's a strong connection actually, because as a planner, you just keep on selling ideas. Your first client is creatives. You have to sell your strategy to creative, and you have to make sure that it's going to work for them, that they're going to buy your strategy and get excited by whatever approach you came up with. So selling is a strong part of communication, and it's a strong part of planning, because after you sell to creative, you obviously have to sell to a client, and ultimately you have to sell to the audience, because that's the one group that you're trying to convince. So I was thinking, I'm advising companies on the daily on where their business should be, how they should conduct their business, how they should conceive their creative campaign, but I've never really been part of a business myself. So I said it was important in my career to have that step, and obviously the project was really interesting for me, so I really believed in what we're doing at StaffMe. So I've been working there for 2 years, became head of sales, building the whole team. We're 6 when I left, 6 sales that was managing to spread the word and get more clients to try out StaffMe, and how quickly and how valuable the solution was for them. And then I had another opportunity at Webedia with Michael Edery, who's still my boss today, and just arrived at Webedia. He was working at Ogilvy One. He was head of strategic planning at Ogilvy One before. Arrived at Webedia, which was a world of publishers, essentially. Loads of huge IPs, great digital media that were like shaping the digital world at that time, which was also a world that was very far from strategic planning. There was like the I think we're the first or second generation of planners ever working at Webedia. So everyone was like, "What do you do again? What's strategic planning? How is it helping me?" I think that's also what made it interesting, because we had to prove our value and to explain our jobs every day to people. So yeah, and then as I said, Webedia then was, I mean, the agency activity of Webedia was acquired by Jellyfish in 2021. So then I was Jellyfish Paris, and then transitioned onto Jellyfish London a year and a half ago now, almost 2 years ago.
Yeah. That you've been working in so many like different companies, like both in-house and agency side. What do you think is the main difference between working in a smaller agency or a bigger like Ogilvy and in-house, like on the creative side? Like, what's your take on that?
I think there's there's definitely a question of size, of course. I think it's might be the connection with the founders, I would say, because the smaller you have, the more, I mean, in my experience at least, the more you're connected to a really strong vision of where we should be as a company, you know. And I've usually found it more difficult to be connected to that vision in bigger companies. So you are more connected to your direct leadership team, and it's always been a question of people, you know, because Ogilvy back in the days, the people working at Ogilvy back in the days are going to be different from the ones working at Ogilvy now, and obviously that has an incidence on the culture and how the company is. I mean, it's obviously very obvious, but I think that company has the value of who's working there at that time. It's the name, but it's also like who's there now, you know, and who's bringing value now. So yeah, I would say connection to the vision, ability to move quickly, trust in teams, and willingness to invest in teams to make things work. Those are the key factors for me.
Interesting. And also, like, you've been working both on the brand marketing side, also sales, and these are kind of usually in different silos. Well, depending on the company and the size, of course. Like, what do you think are the benefit of like having been in like both of these fields for you? Like,
I think that our role, a planner is useful when working on a brief, campaign and everything, but it's also our role to connect the dots between people that don't usually work together. And in order to make that happen, you need to speak different languages. You need to be able to go to data people and understand. You're never going to be you're never going to be an expert as much as they are, of course, and you're not even trying to be that. But you need at least to understand how they think in order to know how they're going to be contributing their best to the project. So I think having worked in different work cultures, very different people, very different expertise, brings you that ability to understand wider diversity of expertise and people, and being able to bring them together for the sake of a project. And also having been strongly connected to the business helps you bring that vision forward, because you at the end of the day, you're selling to a client. You need to understand what their business objectives are, what their marketing objectives are, and the more aligned you are to those, the more you can bring the team together to ensure that everything that's going to be created and conceived as a business partner is going to be contributing to that. And I'm observing a lot of disconnection, you know, nowadays, especially on social. You work with social teams, and because the client structure is usually siloed, especially big companies, when you ask someone from social, most of the time in the client organization, what the business objectives are, they're going to be struggling. Not because they're not interested, just because the way they work, then they're usually not really connected to that. Because there's like a border between the board And the operational teams who are like on the daily making the brand work and put on the content out there, they have so much work that they don't have kind of the luxury to step ahead and understand what we're trying to achieve there. So it's also my role to be like, well, yes, we're putting on that campaign, or we're doing that always on constant strategy, but what is it serving? What are we trying to do here? And is it a shift in perception from A to B, and then what's A, what's B? Who are we competing against? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we try to have some kind of a framework of success that's going to help us understand if we did a good job that year or not? Because that's also the issue. You know, most of the time you work, and when comes the time where you need to assess the success of the collaboration, you're like, where should I look? What does success look like? You know?
Yeah.
Intangible elements that's like measure. It's such a weak point of the industry at the moment. It's so difficult to align goals, actual goals, tangible goals to the way we work.
Yeah.
As partners.
Yeah, exactly. I think like being close to having a close understanding of who are you serving, like who's the client, who's the consumer, it's really valuable. I think I heard, I think it was Jeff Bezos and Amazon. I don't know if it's true, but it's an interesting take. Like every employee had to work 1 week with customer service a year, and it gave a completely different insight on how things work and how the customers or consumers actually perceive it.
Absolutely. You need to be able to see the problem from different perspective. And I think the very notion of perspective is absolutely key and so strongly embedded in the DNA of what strategy is. Because sometimes a good strategy is just shifting the perspective. You know? We see things a certain way. We're conditioned to see things a certain way. But what if we just change the perspective, and then suddenly you see that brand in a whole different way, and you're like, that's so fresh to see it that way, because now like it makes you appreciate that brand differently as well. So yeah, that's why I see like shifting perspectives as like a very sane practice in strategy, but more overall in general. I think it's really fresh to exchange perspective, just like you are doing with the podcast. You know, like I guess like constantly confronting you to different ways of seeing the world is just like nurturing you so much.
Yeah, I feel like I'm learning a lot, and just it's also interesting what you're saying, like your perspective on sales. I also heard, and I had a conversation with Alev, who was the global brand director of Coca-Cola. She also said like if she could change one thing early on in her career, she would like to work in sales, just to get a better understanding of more perspectives, really. And it's really valuable. I would like to hear more about like what inspires you every day, like, to go to work. What do you think gives you like
Well, I think I really appreciate that moment where everything comes together. For me, working on in the creation industry, in advertising, that's mostly your ability to deal with chaos. World is chaos, especially now. Creation is chaos. When you first start working on it, it doesn't make sense. Everything feels like a bit like scattered in all different places. And then your role is to be that line and to be able to bring everything together, which eventually becomes a good creative idea that's able to be out there and connect with people. So I think that's one element that's also how I manage my life, to compose with chaos and make it something that's going to work and that's going to be stable and that's going to be like helpful for me to navigate that world. So that's one element. Another one is love the ability to connect again the dots with very different worlds. So sometimes, let's say you're working for an insurance brand, right? But in order to make it interesting for that insurance brand to connect to young families, for instance, maybe you're going to be interested in what young families in France or in the UK are doing on the daily, and you're going to be connecting those worlds. And that's the magic also for me, is to be like, well, this is like two different worlds. I'm going to deep dive in both of them, and I'm going to build that bridge that's going to make sense when it didn't make sense at first, you know? So that's also like an exercise that I really, really appreciate, because anything could be useful for that thinking, you know? Or sometimes you just doing some random stuff. You're observing people. You that's something that I do quite usually. I'm like a compulsive eavesdropper. So I'm sitting there, maybe creeping out, listening to people. And it's so interesting what you hear in those moments, because people are not especially like realizing that they're being listened to. And you grasp like elements where you're like, oh, that's so interesting to hear that this is how they think about that specific subject. And this is potentially also going to be useful in a brief in the future. And you keep that in your mind, and you know it's going to be like there for whenever you need it, you know? So yeah, this is really what I'm not going to bring you that this whole thing about like we're changing the world. I don't really believe in that. I think that yes, communication is strong vehicle of change in perception. There's no denying, but I'm more into responsibility. I think that we have a responsibility in that role, not to be lying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe, that's funny. I had this conversation yesterday with my partner. I think that good communication is about being true to what the brand is, what the consumer think or perceives the world or your industry, and what the market is truly. And from truth comes something that's going to make it interesting for them, and worst, stopping their scroll or just watching your ad, which is an intrusion, you know? So thinking about this as a trade of I'm asking for your attention for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, whatever. And you're gonna give me that attention, hopefully. And I need to provide you something that needs to be true and genuine and responsible, because that's a trait that I want to reproduce in the future. So I need to build that relation of trust in order for you to give me your attention in the future again. Otherwise, you're going to be like, oh, that's a brand that's lying. They're just like, using techniques that I don't really appreciate, because yes, it gets my attention, but then I'm realizing that, so I'm thinking, I'm trying to think long term for the brands I'm working for. And I think that you don't build something that's going to be long term in terms of relation of trust with consumers if you're lying.
Yeah.
So that's our responsibility as strategists and marketers to make sure that you're bringing something that's going to be plain foundation for communication.
Exactly. For young people starting out in this industry today, what do you have any advice for them?
Brace yourself. I would say good advice would be because you're not really taught politics at work, I found. And that's something that was like kind of a shock for me when I first arrived in a company, because the way I was educated was CELSA, which was the school I was in France, had a strong research DNA. So the way you do research, of course, even though I didn't do a PhD, but you get at least the approach. You have a hypothesis, you have an intuition of something on a subject, then you test it, and then only after that, eventually you come up with a conclusion that potentially needs to be tested again in order to be validated, right? So that's the approach of research. Then you arrive in your first meeting, internship, and let's say you start working on projects. That's day one of the project. You're in that room full of very experienced people, and suddenly there's someone just raising their voice, and they have a conclusion for that project that just started. And everyone's like, "Ooh, that's great." And then you're like, "What? But how? Like, you didn't even like do research. How can you be so sure that it's going to be the, So that's one thing that I think is a bit disturbing when you start, because you realize that for the sake of time, because we have less and less time to work on subjects. So I also get now why sometimes you need to work with intuition, which is not totally wrong, because intuition is also like built out of experience, but that's also something that you need to fight. I think with experience, you need to fight. Yes, intuition is valuable and helpful, but sometimes you also need to consider that it's biased, and you need to rethink whatever project or brand you're going to be working on. You need to see it with a fresh eye. So I think that's something that I would advise anyone starting in the industry is there's going to be politics, and you're going to have to compose with people with ego. You're going to have to compose with difficult personalities. And it's also going to be a skill that you need to develop to understand that and be able to read the room, understand what are the power dynamics at stake. people like shouting at some point or what, all of that is almost as interesting as the work. Sometimes you're like, ooh, okay, that's interesting. And if you don't understand that, there's no way you're going to be able to climb up the ladder.
Yeah, to read the room, know who you're talking to.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean being interested in every conversation or like in the way you do the work. I think that everyone needs to be genuine and really be who you are at work, but also understanding that there are dynamics that you need to have in mind in order
Yeah,
to bring your contribution in the most efficient way.
exactly. We're actually running towards the end. We're running out of time. We could probably talk way more, but I think we'll have that for another time. And Simon, it's been a pleasure to talk to you and all your insights. And do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I mean that would take us to another 10, 15 minutes. I don't want to. No. Thank you so much, honestly, for the opportunity. I think it's always great. Yeah, just to talk and discuss about the industry. It's kind of a group therapy sometimes.
Yeah,
You need to have spaces because it's a difficult industry that we're in. Sometimes it gets a bit schizophrenic, because you're also like very much into the direction of society on sustainability, the necessity to consume less as well, and doing that role, which is like strongly onto marketing, trying to get people to consume more. So there's a lot of tension I found in doing that nowadays in 2024. So I think it's really helpful to open the conversation again and just discuss around ways to make it more valuable for us as well, like as individuals. So thank you so much for the opportunity. That's great. And I think you're
thank you,
doing a
Simon.
great
It's
job
been a
at
it's
that.
been a pleasure.
Cool.